Galactic Academy's vast auditorium hummed with the anticipation of its most elite students gathered from across the known universe. The institution, renowned for training the brightest minds in survival, strategy, and combat, had summoned its top cadets for a test unlike any before. Hovering monitors displayed streams of data, while the Academy's emblem, a luminous star encircled by interwoven planetary rings, shimmered above the vast hall. Professor Ziln, a towering figure with deep crimson scales and piercing golden eyes, surveyed the assembled students with a calculating gaze. His species, the Varnock, were known for their resilience, their bodies honed through centuries of existence on a volatile homeworld. Few questioned his authority. Silence settled over the hall as Zilnail took the stage, his elongated fingers tapping against the control panel embedded in his wrist. With a flicker of light, a holographic projection of a rugged planet materialized behind him. Jagged mountain ranges cut through endless deserts, patches of dense jungle clinging desperately to life against violent storms that crackled with electricity. The image rotated slowly, revealing vast, uncharted territories. "This," Zalen's voice boomed, "is where your test begins." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The students were no strangers to extreme environments, yet this planet, devoid of civilization, pulsing with unknown threats, was something else entirely. Zalen allowed the tension to build before continuing. "You will be dropped onto its surface. Your objective is simple: survive for 72 hours. You will have no access to advanced technology, no weapons, no communication with the Academy. Your instincts and abilities alone will determine whether you endure or fail." He paused, scanning the room. Some cadets straightened their spines, their pride evident. Others exchanged glances, their minds already calculating potential dangers. Then, the professor's gaze landed on the lone human standing among them. James Carter was an outlier. He lacked the bioengineered enhancements of the quarry, whose translucent skin could absorb moisture from the air. He did not possess the Thrixian's exoskeletal armor, nor the Zeltharian's regenerative capabilities. Compared to the other cadets, many of whom had evolved on hostile worlds, he was physically unimpressive. Yet he stood with quiet confidence, arms crossed over his chest, watching Zalnel without a hint of fear. The murmurs in the crowd turned into whispers. Some students openly smirked. "A Death Worlder? Here? He won't last a day. His bones will shatter in the first storm." Selwyn did not acknowledge the remarks. Instead, he simply gestured toward the launch platforms that lined the edge of the hall. "Your pods await. Prepare yourselves." The students filed toward their designated stations. Each was assigned an individual drop pod, sleek, reinforced capsules designed to withstand planetary entry. Inside, restraints would secure their bodies as they hurtled through the atmosphere. The pods had no navigation systems. They would land randomly across the planet, forcing each cadet to rely on their own skill. James approached his pod without hesitation. The smooth metallic surface reflected the dim light overhead as he ran a hand along its edge. Unlike the others, he carried no visible biological advantages, no genetically engineered adaptations. What he did carry was experience. Years of training in unpredictable environments had prepared him for situations far worse than this. As he climbed inside, the pod sealed shut with a hiss. Darkness enveloped him for a moment before the interior displays flickered to life. A countdown appeared. 10 seconds. His breathing remained steady. 5. His fingers flexed against the armrests. 0. The sudden force of acceleration pressed him against the seat as the pod launched, shooting into the void of space before angling downward toward the planet below. Through the reinforced viewport, the vast expanse of the uncharted world rushed toward him. Flames licked at the edges of the pod as it breached the upper atmosphere. The hull vibrated violently, heat building as the descent intensified. The impact was brutal. The pod slammed into the ground, skidding across the terrain before coming to a grinding halt. Dust and debris settled in the aftermath. For several moments, silence reigned. Then, with a sharp exhale, James unfastened the restraints and reached for the manual override, forcing the hatch open. A gust of hot, dry air rushed in as he stepped onto the surface. The landscape stretched endlessly before him. Rolling dunes of fine, rust-colored sand, jagged rock formations jutting from the earth like broken teeth. The twin suns overhead cast an oppressive heat, shimmering waves distorting the horizon. In the distance, what appeared to be a skeletal forest twisted against the sky, its charred remains a grim reminder of the planet's merciless nature. James knelt, running his fingers through the sand. It was fine, almost powder-like, with a faint metallic sheen. Magnetic properties, possibly conductive. Useful if he needed to improvise later. He turned his attention to the wreckage of his pod. As expected, it had sustained heavy damage upon impact. He salvaged what he could, a few scraps of metal plating, fragments of insulation material, and the emergency flare that had survived the crash. Limited resources, but better than nothing. A sudden gust of wind kicked up a cloud of sand, forcing him to shield his eyes. He needed to move. Staying exposed in the open was a death sentence. James scanned the horizon, assessing his options. To the west, rocky outcroppings provided potential cover, though the terrain was treacherous. To the east, the remains of the skeletal forest hinted at possible shelter, though whatever had burned it down remained unknown. He chose the latter. His strides were measured, purposeful. Every step kicked up fine dust, making it difficult to maintain traction, but he adjusted his gait accordingly. The heat was relentless, sweat beginning to bead along his brow. Yet he pressed forward. Minutes stretched into an hour. The forest loomed closer, the ground beneath his feet shifted from sand to hardened earth, cracked and scorched. He reached the edge of the dead trees, their bark brittle beneath his touch. Movement. He froze. Something slithered through the shadows, low to the ground, nearly imperceptible. A predator. James slowly reached for the jagged scrap of metal he had taken from the pod, gripping it tightly. Whatever was out there had been watching him long before he had noticed. The air grew still. Then, in a blur of motion, it struck. James reacted instinctively, his body shifting into a defensive stance as the creature lunged from the shadows. It was fast, too fast for most species to track with the naked eye, but his reflexes, honed through years of training, allowed him to move just in time. He pivoted sharply, narrowly avoiding the strike as the beast's elongated, serrated limbs slashed through the space where he had just stood. The force of its attack sent dust and charred bark flying. He barely had a moment to analyze the predator before it coiled again, preparing for another lunge. Its form was low to the ground, a blend of sinewy muscle and sharp exoskeletal plating that reflected the dim sunlight filtering through the skeletal remains of the forest. Its elongated head bore no visible eyes, only a set of heat-sensitive ridges running along its skull. It hunted by tracking movement and temperature. An apex predator in this wasteland. James didn't wait for it to strike first. He moved, darting sideways to put distance between himself and the creature. His grip tightened around the jagged scrap of metal he had salvaged from the pod. It wasn't an ideal weapon, but in the right hands it could be deadly. The creature lunged again. This time he was ready. He sidestepped at the last moment, angling his body to minimize exposure, and slashed upward with his makeshift blade. The metal edge met resistance as it sliced across the creature's side, sparks flying as the serrated exoskeleton deflected part of the blow. A thin, viscous fluid oozed from the wound, dark and iridescent. The creature recoiled, its ridges pulsating as it processed the pain. James didn't let it recover. He pressed forward, driving the scrap metal toward what he assumed was a weak point near the base of its skull. The beast twisted at the last second, causing the strike to glance off its armor. It retaliated with a powerful swipe, its taloned limbs slamming into his side and sending him crashing into the brittle remains of a tree. Bark crumbled beneath him as he hit the ground hard, the impact momentarily knocking the air from his lungs. Pain flared through his ribs, but he forced himself to move. He rolled as the creature pounced, its claws embedding into the dirt where he had just lain. He scrambled to his feet, muscles screaming in protest. The predator growled, a low, guttural vibration that resonated through the air. It was wounded, but not deterred. James adjusted his grip on the metal shard, breathing heavily as he calculated his next move. He couldn't outlast it in a prolonged fight. Its natural armor gave it an advantage. He needed to end this quickly. His eyes flicked to his surroundings. The remains of the forest were unstable. Charred branches, dry, brittle trunks, crumbling debris. A strategy formed in his mind. He took a deliberate step back, feigning exhaustion. The creature tensed, sensing weakness. It charged, claws extended for the kill. At the last possible moment, James pivoted and drove his heel into the weakened base of a dead tree. The brittle trunk gave way instantly, toppling forward with a deafening crack. The creature, mid-lunge, had no time to change course. The falling tree slammed onto its back, pinning it against the scorched earth with a sickening crunch. The predator thrashed, its limbs clawing at the air, but the weight of the collapsed tree restricted its movements. James didn't hesitate. He rushed forward, using the tree as leverage, and drove his metal shard deep into the exposed flesh between the beast's ridges. This time the blow struck true. The creature let out a choked hiss, its body convulsing once before going still. Silence settled over the ruins of the forest. James exhaled, stepping back to assess the damage. His ribs ached. His breath came in ragged gulps, but he was alive. He crouched near the fallen predator, observing its anatomy. The exoskeleton had been nearly impenetrable, but the softer areas along its joints and ridges had proven vulnerable. Valuable knowledge if he encountered more. He wiped the blade of his makeshift weapon against his sleeve, then turned his attention to the surrounding landscape. The skeletal remains of the trees offered some protection from the elements, but they wouldn't last through the night. He needed a more secure shelter, one that could shield him from the planet's unpredictable dangers. His gaze drifted to a ridge further ahead, where jagged rock formations jutted from the ground like the remnants of an ancient battlefield. Natural caves could exist within those formations. Shelter. He began moving, his steps deliberate, every movement calculated. The twin suns had shifted slightly, casting elongated shadows across the terrain. Time was slipping away. If he didn't secure a defensible position before nightfall, he wouldn't survive long enough to see the next sunrise. As he made his way toward the ridge, his mind processed everything with sharp efficiency. The landscape was unforgiving, but he had already proven that adaptability was his greatest weapon. His encounter with the predator had provided valuable insight. If the planet harbored creatures like that, he needed to be prepared for worse. He pressed forward, navigating the cracked earth and brittle remains of the forest. His ribs throbbed with every step, but he ignored the discomfort. Pain was secondary to survival. The ridge loomed closer, its towering formations casting deep shadows against the barren ground. As he neared the base of the rocks, something caught his attention. A faint, almost imperceptible shimmer in the air just beyond the ridge. An anomaly. James narrowed his eyes, slowing his pace. Instinct told him that whatever lay beyond was not part of the natural terrain. His pulse steadied as he adjusted his grip on his makeshift weapon. He was no longer alone. James stood at the base of the ridge, his breath steady despite the dull ache in his ribs. The anomaly ahead shimmered faintly in the air, almost like a mirage. It was unnatural, something that didn't belong in this barren wasteland. His instincts warned him to approach with caution. He tightened his grip on the jagged metal shard, still stained with the dark fluid of the predator he had slain earlier. His muscles tensed as he took a slow, deliberate step forward. The shimmering distortion flickered, shifting like a ripple in water. Then, with a sudden pulse, the air around it collapsed inward, revealing what had been hidden. A structure emerged, partially buried beneath the jagged rocks. It was old, worn by time and the unforgiving elements, but unmistakably artificial. The walls, dark and metallic, bore the scars of battle. deep gashes torn through the reinforced plating. Vines, long dead, clung to its surface, a testament to how long it had remained undiscovered. James exhaled slowly, scanning the area. There were no immediate signs of movement, no indication that anyone had been here in years, but that didn't mean it was abandoned. If this was a remnant of a previous expedition, or worse, a forgotten battlefield, then he had to assume there were dangers inside. He moved closer, his steps careful, eyes scanning for any tripwires or hidden triggers. He reached into a pocket for the entrance had partially collapsed, but a narrow gap between two crumbling metal panels allowed just enough space for him to slip through. Inside, darkness swallowed him whole. The air was stale, thick with the scent of rust and decay. He let his eyes adjust, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of the walls as he moved forward. The corridor was narrow, lined with broken light fixtures that once illuminated the path. Now, only the occasional flicker of a failing power source cast brief flashes of dim, ghostly light. He proceeded cautiously, keeping his breathing steady as he advanced deeper into the ruins. The silence was oppressive, the kind that made even the smallest noise feel deafening. Every step echoed slightly, bouncing off the walls of whatever structure this had once been. He pressed forward, his instincts sharp, his senses on high alert. Then, his foot brushed against something unnatural. He froze. Lowering himself slowly, he reached out, fingers tracing along the surface of an object half buried beneath a layer of dust and debris. It was smooth, metallic, different from the walls. Carefully, he pulled it free, brushing away the dirt. His pulse quickened as he realized what he was holding, a weapon. Not primitive, not a makeshift tool like the shard he carried. This was advanced, designed for war. The grip molded perfectly to fit an organic hand, the barrel sleek and compact. He turned it over, searching for any indication of its power source. The markings on its side were faded, but he recognized the script, Quirion design. A race known for their advanced plasma-based weaponry. This wasn't just a forgotten outpost, it had been a battleground. James's mind worked quickly, piecing together the implications. If this place had been abandoned after a conflict, then there was a chance some of the systems were still operational. He needed supplies, anything that could give him an advantage in surviving this planet's brutal conditions. Holstering the weapon at his side, he pushed forward, scanning the corridor for anything useful. The hallway widened ahead, opening into what looked like a control room. The walls were lined with shattered monitors, their screens cracked but still flickering weakly with distorted images. Cables hung from the ceiling, some sparking intermittently. In the center of the room, a terminal stood intact, its interface dark but otherwise undamaged. James approached, pressing his palm against the console. A delay. Then, with a strained hum, the system whirred to life. Dim blue light flickered across the screen, and distorted data scrolled rapidly before stabilizing into recognizable text. He exhaled sharply. If he could access the logs, he might be able to find out what happened here, and more importantly, if there were any remaining resources. His fingers moved across the interface, navigating through corrupted files and fragmented audio logs. Most were beyond recovery, but one managed to partially load. He adjusted the settings, amplifying the weak signal until a distorted voice crackled through the speakers. Transmission compromised. Evacuation failed. Hostile forces hold until reinforcements arrive. The message cut out abruptly, leaving only static. James frowned, replaying the words in his mind. Hostile forces. Whatever had attacked this place had forced an evacuation, but there was no mention of survivors. He studied the surroundings again, a chill running down his spine. If something had wiped out an entire outpost, it was either long gone or still here. He turned back to the console, searching for anything else of value. One last active command flickered on the screen. Storage bay lockdown. Engaged. His brow furrowed. A storage bay meant supplies, weapons, potentially something that could change the course of his survival, but if it was locked down, that meant something inside had been deemed dangerous. He considered his options. Risk was unavoidable in his situation. If he wanted a chance at lasting on this planet, he needed to take it. He navigated to the control settings, searching for a manual override. The system resisted at first, but after a few calculated adjustments, the console let out a sharp beep, and the screen displayed a simple message: lockdown, disengaged. A distant metallic groan reverberated through the structure, followed by the sound of heavy doors unlocking somewhere beyond the room. The air grew tense, the silence now carrying an underlying threat. James stood still, listening. Then something moved in the darkness beyond the corridor, a slow, deliberate shift of weight. Not an echo, not the groan of old machinery. Something alive. His pulse steadied, his fingers flexing over the newly acquired weapon. He had just opened something that had been locked away for a reason, and now, whatever was inside knew it was no longer trapped. He had mere seconds before it found him. James remained perfectly still, his heartbeat steady despite the tension coiling in his muscles. The sound from the corridor was unmistakable. Slow, measured steps, the weight of something heavy shifting through the darkened ruins. He tightened his grip on the plasma weapon he had retrieved from the outpost, the cool metal pressing against his palm. He had no way of knowing what had been locked behind the storage bay doors, but if it had been deemed too dangerous to be left free, then he had just made a critical mistake. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the faint scraping of metal against metal. Whatever it wasn't moving randomly. It was hunting. He exhaled slowly through his nose, forcing himself to think. The room was small, with no alternative exits aside from the main corridor leading back into the ruins. Running wasn't an option. He needed to see what he was dealing with before making a move. Keeping low, he shifted behind a broken console, angling himself for the best possible line of sight without exposing his position. The first thing he saw were the eyes, glowing slits of pale amber, cutting through the shadows like a predator's gaze beneath the cover of night. The figure was humanoid, but its movements were mechanical, precise. As it stepped fully into view, the dim blue glow of the failing emergency lights cast flickering shadows over its body. It was a machine, but not an ordinary one. The Warframe was sleek, its outer shell composed of interlocking plates of dark alloy, marred with deep battle scars and the faded insignia of the long-abandoned facility. Portions of its armor had been stripped away, revealing intricate wiring beneath. A cybernetic construct that had once served a purpose but had long since fallen into silence. The most unsettling detail, however, was its posture. Unlike mindless automated security drones, this thing moved with intent, as though it was aware, assessing its surroundings with an intelligence that suggested it was more than just a remnant of old warfare. James remained motionless, his mind working rapidly to analyze the situation. The Warframe hadn't detected him yet. Its gaze swept the room methodically, its head tilting slightly as if scanning for movement. It carried no ranged weapons, but its arms ended in elongated fingers, each tipped with razor-sharp talons capable of cutting through reinforced plating. Close-quarters combat was out of the question. His eyes flicked to the console he had used to disengage the lockdown. If this machine had been trapped inside the storage bay, then the logs might still contain some information on what exactly it was and why it had been locked away. He needed a distraction. He reached down, carefully grasping a small fragment of metal debris at his feet. With a precise flick of his wrist, he sent it clattering toward the far side of the room. The Warframe's head snapped in the direction of the noise, its movements instantaneous. It took a single step toward the disturbance before pausing, as if analyzing the sound's origin. That brief hesitation was all James needed. He moved. Darting forward with silent precision, he reached the console and activated the interface. The screen flickered, displaying corrupted text and error messages. His fingers flew over the controls, bypassing the damaged code and forcing access to the remaining operational files. A fragmented data log surfaced, flickering on the screen in half-legible text. Designation: Project Revenant. Status: Terminated. Containment protocol engaged. Directive override detected. Initialization in progress. James barely had time to process the last line before the Warframe's head snapped toward him. Reinitialization. It had been waking up the moment the lockdown was lifted. He moved on instinct as the machine lunged, its talons slicing through the air where he had stood just seconds before. The impact sent sparks flying as it shredded through the console, destroying whatever information had been left. He rolled to the side, plasma weapon in hand, and fired. The first shot struck its shoulder, sending a burst of molten energy searing through its outer plating. The Warframe recoiled, not from pain, but from recalculating its strategy. It adjusted instantly, its movements shifting from mechanical efficiency to something disturbingly fluid, as though adapting mid-combat. It lunged again, closing the distance faster than he anticipated. Carter's launched a reply. James barely dodged as a clawed hand tore through the wall behind him, carving deep into the metal. He fired another shot, this time aiming for the exposed wiring beneath its damaged plating. The plasma burned through, causing the machine to stagger, its movements momentarily erratic. That was his chance. He turned and sprinted toward the exit, weaving through the debris as the Warframe regained its balance. The corridor outside was narrow, lined with collapsed structures that formed natural obstacles. If he could use the terrain to his advantage, he might be able to slow it down. He pushed forward, his footsteps echoing through the ruins. Behind him, he heard the Warframe give chase. It was fast. Faster than it had any right to be. His mind raced, analyzing the layout ahead. The hallway opened into a secondary chamber, filled with collapsed beams and unstable flooring. If he could bait it into overextending itself, he might be able to turn the environment into a weapon. He reached the chamber just as the Warframe closed in. Without breaking stride, he fired a shot at the ceiling, striking a weakened support beam. The structure groaned under the force, debris cascading down in a violent chain reaction. At the last second, he dove forward, rolling as the ceiling partially collapsed behind him. The Warframe had no time to react. A cascade of rubble crashed down, burying it beneath tons of broken metal and stone. James landed hard, his breath coming in sharp gasps. Dust filled the air, obscuring his vision. He pushed himself up, plasma weapon still gripped tightly in his hands, and waited. The debris remained still, no movement beneath the wreckage. He didn't believe for a second that it was destroyed. He turned and continued moving, putting as much distance between himself and the ruins as possible. The facility had given him more questions than answers. Whatever Project Revenant had been, it wasn't just another failed experiment. The way it moved, the way it reacted, it wasn't mindless. And worse, he had a feeling it wasn't the only one. James moved swiftly through the ruins, his pulse steady despite the lingering tension coiling through his body. His breathing remained controlled, each step calculated as he navigated the treacherous landscape of collapsed corridors and fractured structures. The dust from the partial cave-in still hung in the air behind him, drifting in slow, lazy spirals under the dim glow of emergency lights that flickered intermittently. His instincts told him the Warframe wasn't finished. Machines like that didn't die easily. If it was built for combat, it was built to survive. Burying it under debris had bought him time, nothing more. He needed distance. More than that, he needed a plan. Ahead, the corridor widened into another chamber, this one more intact than the previous sections. The walls bore the same faded insignia as the Warframe's plating, a mark of whatever force had once occupied this outpost. Terminals lined the room, some long dead, others humming weakly with residual power. He scanned them quickly, searching for anything operational. If he could access the outpost's power grid, he might be able to find structural schematics, an escape route, or even a means to disable whatever systems were still functioning. One of the consoles flickered as he approached. its screen distorting with lines of broken code before stabilizing. His fingers moved across the interface, bypassing corrupted data streams and locked files. Most of the logs were useless, fragments of old communications, automated distress signals that had long since gone unanswered. But then, a single active file surfaced. Project Revenant, final report. Status: failed. Forced containment initiated. Reason: behavioral instability/loss of control. James's eyes narrowed as he scrolled through the report. The text was fragmented, sections missing due to data corruption, but the message was clear enough. The Warframe had not simply been abandoned, it had been imprisoned. Whatever its original purpose had been, it had become too dangerous to control. Further down, a secondary notation caught his attention. AI Core Integrity Unknown. Unit 1 Containment Status Compromised. His fingers hovered over the console. Unit 1-that meant there had been more than one. A low vibration shuddered through the floor beneath him. He went still, his muscles tensing as he listened. The sound was distant but growing. Metal grinding against metal, the unmistakable resonance of movement within the structure. He had underestimated its resilience. The Warframe was already digging itself out. He exhaled sharply, shutting down the console and stepping away. The facility's layout was still a mystery to him, but staying in one place was no longer an option. He scanned the room, his gaze landing on a partially collapsed doorway at the far end. It was tight but passable. More importantly, it led deeper into the outpost, away from the Warframe's last known location. Moving quickly, he slipped through the narrow gap, his shoulders brushing against the jagged edges of twisted metal as he forced his way through. The space beyond was darker, less stable. Exposed wiring crackled faintly overhead, casting flickering shadows along the walls. The air was heavier here, thick with the scent of rust and decay. As he advanced, the passage began to slope downward. The architecture shifted, becoming less like a military installation and more like a research facility. Reinforced glass lined sections of the walls, though most of it had been shattered, leaving only jagged remnants in place. He stepped over scattered debris, his mind processing the change in design. This wasn't just an outpost. It had been a testing ground. A soft glow caught his attention up ahead. Unlike the flickering emergency lights, this illumination was steady, pulsing faintly from behind a partially closed blast door. He approached cautiously, pressing his back against the wall as he angled his head to peer inside. The room beyond was vast, filled with towering containment units, their glass panels covered in a thick layer of dust. Some remained intact, their contents obscured by darkness. Others had been shattered, their interiors empty. The air carried a sterile, artificial chill, the remnants of a long-deactivated climate control system. He stepped inside, his boots making no sound against the cold metal floor. The Warframe had been labeled as Unit 1. That meant others had existed. Were they all like the one he had encountered? Had they all been sealed away, locked behind security measures that had long since deteriorated? Moving between the containment units, he kept his weapon raised, ready for any sign of movement. The facility's silence felt unnatural, as though something within these walls still lingered, waiting. His gaze landed on a terminal embedded in the central control panel. Unlike the others he had encountered, this one was still operational, its screen glowing faintly with lines of running diagnostics. He approached, fingers moving over the interface as he accessed the data logs. Project Revenant, Subject Logs. Unit 2, Status Decommissioned. Unit 3, Status Decommissioned. Unit 4, Status Decommissioned. Unit 5, Status Unknown. His pulse steadied. Unit 5, if its status was unknown, then there was a possibility it was still active. But where? A sharp beep interrupted his thoughts. The screen flickered, new text appearing. Warning, containment breach detected. Unit 1, active, recalibrating systems. James didn't wait. He shut down the terminal and turned toward the exit. The Warframe wasn't just operational, it was regaining control. As he moved, a faint noise reached him from deeper within the facility. A slow, deliberate mechanical, rhythmic. It wasn't coming from the Warframe behind him. It was coming from ahead, Unit 5. His grip on the weapon tightened as he advanced toward the sound. If another one of these machines was active, he needed to find it before it found him. He pressed forward, his mind sharpening with singular focus. He wasn't just trying to survive anymore. He was uncovering something far bigger than he had ever anticipated.